Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next webinar of the academic year, supporting our safeguarders, managing the emotional changes. I'm very excited to be joined here today by Faye McGuinness, who is Director of Programmes at Educational Support, Beverly Nucky, who is Head Teacher at Linden Primary School, and our very own Mike Glanville, who is our Chief Safeguarding Officer. Just a few notes before we start. Everyone who is registered will be emailed a recording of this webinar. We'll be having a Q&A at the end of this session, and you can ask your questions just to the right of your screen. At the bottom, you'll see that there is a question tab. If you just click on that and you can pop your questions in there. Our wonderful panel have also said that if we don't get time to answer all of your questions, then they will answer them when the webinar is finished, and the answers will get sent to you when we send you the recording as well. So without further ado, let's introduce our panel. Faye, please can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Vicky. Absolutely brilliant to be here. So as Vicky says, I'm Faye McGuinness. I'm the Director of Programmes at the charity Education Support. Education Support are the only UK charity dedicated to supporting the mental health and wellbeing of everybody that works in the education sector. We were set up around 145 years ago, so much longer than I've been around. And we were set up by teachers for teachers. And as I say, we're here to support the whole workforce. So it's great to join you today and talk about how we can support specifically those that are dealing with safeguarding.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Bev, please can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, I'm Bev Nucky and I'm a head teacher in Llanedin Primary School in Cardiff.
You apologise.
No, it was a good effort. I've been teaching for, well, too long maybe, but nearly 30 years. I taught in England for quite some time and now I'm teaching in Wales. And I've been involved in safeguarding throughout my whole career in various guises.
Fantastic. And Mike, please, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Glanville. I'm Chief Safeguarding Officer for the Safeguarding Company. My background is actually in policing, so I was a senior police officer for many years with some experience in safeguarding and child protection work. And I also happen to be a chair of governors as well, school governor in a primary school down here in sunny Dorset. Well, it's not so sunny now. For the company, I look after all of the safeguarding services and also have oversight of our customer success team. And it's great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation, Vicky.
Fantastic, thank you. And I am Vicky Chafe. I am Head of Community Relations here at the Safeguarding Company, and I am very excited to be chairing this webinar. We want this webinar to be as interactive as possible. So throughout this webinar, you are all going to be asked a number of questions. These are then going to go into a poll and we're going to discuss your answers as a panel. So we are going to ask you your first poll question. How many people are in your safeguarding team? So hopefully there should be a poll just at the bottom to the right where you should be able to all. Oh, it's even popped up there, so you can click how many DSLs and are in your or safeguarding leads that are in your organisation, and you can submit. And if you just click on the polls at the bottom right next to the questions, you can see a live count of how many we've got. Well, it's great to see that we've got more than 5 is second in the running, and 2 to 3 is top. And it makes me very happy to see that there's only a small percentage at the moment that have got 1 member in their safeguarding team. Fabulous. So do you think that that's, let's go to Faye, do you think that is representative, that most schools tend to have more than just 1, have between 2 and 3 in their safeguarding team?
I think it varies in terms of the school, the area, location. So yeah, I think that's a tricky one to answer without having the kind of data in front of us. I think it's good to see that we're seeing more and more schools realising that this shouldn't just sit on the shoulders of one person, and actually to make sure that you can deliver this safely and well, and to also make sure that safeguarding leads are able to support each other, that having more than one safeguarding lead is important. So that's really good to see that poll result and to see those numbers.
Absolutely. And obviously it will differ from high schools to primary schools and to pupil numbers and to pupil sizes as well. If you are a small rural primary school, then you might only have capacity and the resource to have one. So it very much depends on the setting that you're in as well. Fabulous. So we shall start with our first question. So our first question for the panel is, our DSLs are managing a lot of additional stresses, including taking home worries for our children and our families. Can you give some suggestions about how our DSLs can manage their work-life balance? So Faye, I'm going to come to you first. Can you offer some suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing I want to talk about actually is stress, because actually the start of that question is about additional stresses. And I think it's really important that when our safeguarding leads and those responsible for safeguarding are thinking about stress, that we recognise that stresses and stress are two different things. So as individuals, we may have a range of stressors that are causing us stress. And we can often believe that when we get rid of those stressors, the stress has gone. But actually, that's not the reality. And so the stress sits within us. And there's a really important piece of work that we need to do, which is to try and get that stress out of our bodies, because we know the impact of stress, both on us mentally and physically, can be quite damaging. So in a really interesting book written by Emily and Amelia Nagoski called Burnout, they talk about the stress cycle. And they talk about the importance of closing that stress cycle. It's not just good enough to get rid of those stressors. So it's really important that individuals on this webinar are thinking about how they're closing their stress cycles to be able to manage their own stressors and their own mental health and well-being. And just on that, they talk about evidence-based ways that we can close our stress cycles. And so some of these you might roll your eyes at because you would have heard about them before, but the evidence suggests that these are really important. So physical activity, breathing, taking time to breathe properly, positive social interaction, laughter, having affection, feeling and giving, crying is a really good way to solve your stress cycle, and also a creative expression. So I just wanted to touch on that because I think that's a really important point when we talk about stress. I think in terms of managing work-life balance, I would touch on three things. I think fundamentally the only way that we can manage work-life balance is if we set boundaries. And I know that can be easier said than done. But actually, if we don't have boundaries and we're not clear about what those boundaries are, it will be very difficult to maintain a work-life balance. So I would encourage people to be thinking about what are your well-being non-negotiables? What are the absolutely fundamental things that you need to do to keep yourself well? How are you creating boundaries around those non-negotiables? And how are you communicating them to your colleagues, to your line manager, and to those within your organisation? So we often talk about the boundary bag. What do you have in your boundary bag around your physical needs, your mental needs, your emotional needs, your social needs? So creating space, and actually it's a skill, setting and keeping boundaries is a skill. But if we want to talk about work-life balance, we have to talk about boundaries. The second thing is that we know that for many people working in education, and maybe particularly in these roles, there's a sense of actually things that we have no control over. And that sense that things are being done to us and that we have no control over those things. So there's a really interesting exercise that individuals can do, and you can do these in teams as well, to think about what is within your control, what can you influence, and what do you have concerns about that you have no control over. And actually being able to kind of assess that and think that through can be quite helpful in thinking about what you can leave at work, what you can park, and how you can create that balance between work and home. And if people are saying, well, there's lots of things that we're concerned about, particularly in safeguarding roles, which is, completely understandable. You've got lots to be concerned about. It's then thinking about what are the tools and strategies that you can put in place to recognise that you're concerned about those things, but that actually if you spend lots of time overthinking and ruminating on those, that can lead to things like stress, anxiety and worry. So we talk about something called worry time, really simple technique that actually you can allocate time in your diary, whether it's a weekly basis every couple of weeks, which you would allocate as worry time, where you're able to spend some time thinking about the things you're concerned about, writing them down, maybe putting them away. And then if you come back the next week and you still have that worry, you can still reflect and you can continue to write about that worry. But what it allows you to do is to start to put a boundary around some of the things that you're concerned about that can be left within work so that you have that space at home to have your personal life. And then I think the last thing that I would say is to try and implement and practice transitioning out of your day. What happens is our work bleeds into our life. And quite often what we need to do is we need to have some activity that actually closes off the work day and begins our time out of work. So transitioning out of the day might be that you do something really physical. So it could be literally that you put a Post-it note on the wall at work and say, I am leaving. That's your kind of physical sign to yourself that you're transitioning. Some of the research and advice talks about, writing down something that's gone well in that day as a way to close off, and so that you're not ruminating on all the things that you're worried about when you leave. So I think there's a really important piece there for those on the webinar to think about, how do you transition out of your work day to move into your kind of personal day? So work-life balance is one of those areas that you could talk about for hours, and it's much easier to talk about than to do. But actually, if we start with those small practical steps, hopefully they can make a difference.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. Thank you. I think that setting boundaries is something that everybody struggles with, isn't it? And I think that that's a really good, solid place to start with when you're trying to manage your work-life balance. Fabulous. Bev, how do you manage your own work-life balance?
I think that's so interesting what Faye was saying there about setting boundaries, and something that always strikes me is actually taking responsibility. I talked to my staff as we started the year, and initially they laughed at me saying this, but I think it rings true that if anything happens to you, I said to my staff, we'll all be so sad. We'd possibly come to a funeral, tell funny stories about you, but then ultimately we'd employ somebody else. However, for your family, that hole that you'd leave wouldn't be so easily filled. And so although the employer has a responsibility, you also have a responsibility for yourself, because you are important, and placing that value on yourself, so that you do actually think about how you are going to have this work-life balance. It's so easy now, isn't it, with everything on our phones and being contactable 24 hours a day, it seems, that it is incredibly difficult to set those boundaries. So some of the things I do, I think it's about prioritizing what's important. So I take responsibility for that. I prioritize what is actually really important to do today, what can wait, what doesn't actually ever have to be done, and being confident in that. And as Faye said about communicating that to colleagues, if I can't do it today, when can I do it by? Do I need extra time for that? And actually having that open and honest dialogue with staff around you, so that you're in that supportive environment, so that people know that it's not that you're not saying that you can't do something just because you don't want to, but it actually because you know that it is going to have a significant impact on you if you just try and fit it in. I think something that I do as well is to try to be as organized as I can and to prepare, because I think that gives you confidence in the day, and it gives you confidence in what you're doing. And so that you're not rushing from one thing to another and never actually doing anything properly. I also have given up multitasking. I was never very good at it, but I don't think that that's helpful at all. I think it's much better to focus on something so that you can get it done. I mean, we all have many interruptions in our day, don't we? But I think you have to prioritize some time where you can get into the flow of something, where you can do some deep thinking about it, where you can actually get that work done. And I think you have to be quite disciplined about that, because you can waste time in certain areas if you flit from one thing to another, or if you don't give it that dedicated focused time. And I think you need to know when to stop. And sometimes you have to just think, that is enough. I can't do any more today. I need now to stop. I think there has to be some acceptance that at different times of your working year, sometimes are going to be more busy than others, and some you might want to put more hours in on those times. But then I think you have to then compensate and take time and ensure that you take time then not to be just constantly working at the highest level that you can. I think you have to sometimes draw back and think, I need to have some reflective time here. I need to have time where I can consider things and think about my next steps. Something that I think about as well is that there's a lot of talk about me time and having me time. I don't consider anything I do not me time, because this is my life. This is the only time I've got. And so I don't want to have to compartmentalize something and just put my me time over there. This is about me doing a job that I'm passionate about, I'm interested in, that is fulfilling me too. And if it's not, then I think it's taking steps to ensure that I am having that fulfillment from it. I try and overlap as much as I can. I've got lots and lots of interests outside of work, and I think to have other things to think about when you come away from work, because otherwise work will take over. And I try to have we talk a lot in work about having 6 elements to your life, and we talk about having family and friendships, being productive, but also giving back to the community, being physical in your life. And that for some people it might mean going out for a run. For me, it's trying to walk the dog, maybe do some yoga, and it links to phase breathing, and then having that spiritual aspect. So for some people it might be a religion, for others it might be going out into nature, but having that balance so that work isn't everything, that it's a small part of your life, so that actually the other parts are of equal importance as well.
Absolutely. And so it reminded me of something that a head teacher once said to me when I was a DSL, and that was to be kind to yourself. There's no harsher critic than yourself, and it's quite difficult sometimes to be kind to yourself, isn't it? But you're absolutely right. This is all me time, and I need to be kind to myself with the decisions and things that I've made to prioritize me as well, because there is only one me. Fabulous. Okay, Mike, are there anything that schools can do to support their DSLs to have more of a work-life balance?
Yeah, I think if we look at it from, from an organisational perspective, I suppose the first thing for me would be, thinking about the safeguarding culture and culture of the organisation, and how the organisation itself is supporting individuals that are actually carrying out really challenging roles, in that organisation. So for the DSL, I think, thinking about what kind of support the organisation can provide to those individuals in different ways. And as well, the DSLs themselves and the deputy DSLs especially, thinking about how they fit into that organisation as well. So ideally what you want is an organisation where there's an open and a sort of kind of transparent approach to communication, where there's a sense of support. The idea that DSLs especially can be very open about how they feel about their role. They can be dealing with very complex issues on a day-to-day basis, very difficult issues. And when you're dealing with, difficult families, sometimes you're dealing with children with some, very serious issues, working with other agencies, quite often working, in demanding situations where there's time pressures and so on. What I noticed, particularly as a governor in the school where I happen to be, is the fact we have got a team of DSLs. We've got a DSL who happens to be the head teacher as well, and we've got 2 people supporting that head teacher as deputies. But quite often it does fall to the head teacher. And what you find with a lot of DSLs is they've got other roles and they've got other responsibilities. So the demands can be incredibly, high for those individuals. What I find as well is that there's this sense sometimes of I wouldn't go as far as say it's loneliness, but you've got, individuals working very much on their own on a very regular basis as well, particularly in smaller organizations. So therefore the kind of the cultural side of it, I think, is really important, and understanding how that kind of, works. I think from a leadership perspective, I think it's really important that senior leaders and particularly governors as well are in a position to understand the stresses and strains of the DSL role, are in a position to understand what those individuals are actually having to manage on a day-to-day basis. Doesn't mean to say that they need to get into the details of those individual cases, particularly if they're a governor, but they do need to understand what the risks are. They need to understand what kind of impact some of these cases are having on individuals. And the governing bodies have got a really important role to play, haven't they, in terms of not just challenge, but supporting individuals as well. And I think that's an incredibly important role. And I'm not convinced that all governors have a really good understanding of the roles and responsibilities of a DSL. And if they did, they might spend a bit more time talking to DSLs about that. And I think, so when governors are going into school and they're doing their monitoring visits and they're talking to the DSL about safeguarding, they also need to be talking to them about how they're managing those cases, the impact it's having on those individuals, and thinking about what kind of support they can provide to them. I think is a really important, part of the role. And there's a sense, certainly from my experience, that you've got organizations actually that can provide much more support in terms of that culture to the individuals that are operating within it. So just one quick example, you think about the frustrations sometimes of operating in an organization where there are poor systems and poor support and poor processes in place, and how frustrating that can be for individuals operating in those circumstances. And that's something else to think about, that actually quite often stresses and strains can be created by the organization because they haven't got efficient systems in place or efficient processes in place. We've all heard those stories, haven't we, day to day, working in organizations where things don't work or they can't access various aspects of the of support. So I think that's also important, is trying to understand what kind of practical things schools can do to support people that are doing a really difficult job and under really difficult circumstances on occasions, and that the organization can help massively in reducing some of those stresses and strains and making the role of the DSL much easier to manage on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. And I, as a safeguarding governor as well, it's making sure that there's enough resource put towards safeguarding and keeping that as a priority. And in fact, that's a really good place for us to go on to our next poll, because this is a really important one and it's something that is very close to my heart. So our next poll question, and I'm really interested to see this one, is: do you receive structured supervision? So again, if you just click on submit your vote, and again, if you click on the polls, you'll be able to see. I think it's a lot closer than I was expecting, which is quite a good sign. But still, not receiving structured supervision is still the highest vote, certainly from our delegates, and it saddens me to my absolute core to hear that. So without further ado, let's move on to our next question, which is: supervision isn't mandatory in schools. Why is it so important that schools make sure that their DSLs have access to supervision, and how do they know which type is best? So, Mike, as Chair of Governors, is this something that you've been championing in your school?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, we're part of a MAT, so we're a part of a 19-school MAT here in Dorset. And the MAT have recently employed a dedicated person to provide supervision for DSLs. And the feedback I'm getting so far is really positive, very positive indeed. And it's making, and I don't think even the DSLs themselves have really understood what the benefits would be until they've actually sat down with this person, and suddenly they've actually realized, there's this realization that they needed to open up about some of these cases that we're dealing about. And again, it's not necessarily going into the detail of those cases, but just having a kind of, a professional sounding board, I would call it. Somebody who's in a position to be able to facilitate, a professional conversation about, some of these cases, and also providing emotional support as well. So that has had a big impact on our team, in a positive way. So that's great. At a very local level inside the school, I think there's things in terms of, what I would call informal support and supervision, I think is still very important. So in addition to those kind of formal arrangements, we're also thinking about, for example, the role of the named safeguarding lead, making sure that that individual understands what is meant by supervision, is in a position to have conversations, meaningful conversations with the DSL team, and is able to ask the right questions, and manage those conversations in a sensitive way. So, and that's not something I don't think which I've seen a lot of in other schools in terms of that role, that named safeguarding governor role. So it's very much being focused on, if you like, the brass tacks of safeguarding in terms of the risk and understanding the trends and that kind of thing. But this is more focused on obviously the individual and providing support to those individuals. So I think that's important. And I think, as I said earlier on, I think it's really important for governors just to understand and recognise the challenges that are being faced by DSLs. That's really important. So they understand the risk, they understand what kind of issues they're having to manage on a day-to-day basis. So I think there's a lot, even if you're in a MAT, there's a lot that local governors can do to kind of support, their DSL teams. And I think MATs, by taking this approach, obviously, it's a very efficient way of being able to manage supervision across 19 schools. If you've got, one person providing that kind of service, and certainly the feedback we've had so far is incredibly positive, as I say.
That's fantastic to hear, and certainly something that most governors should be pushing for, and making sure that funding is available for that.
Yeah.
So, Faye, speaking of funding, how do you suggest that schools manage the supervision, and do you think that cost is a barrier?
Yeah, so I think firstly, it's probably worth us being clear on what we mean when we talk about supervision, because actually I think there's a lot of language around supervision and it can be a little bit murky and people get a little bit confused. And so I think, being clear on what supervision isn't in this context that we're talking about it's not line management. It's not supervision of clinical practice. So we're not talking about counsellors or clinicians getting supervision. That's a different thing. And it's also not therapy. So I think it's being really clear about what professional supervision isn't. And actually what it is, it's around creating a space for learning, for reflection, for development. And it's all organised around your professional role. It always links back to the job and the work that you're doing. It's about your professional identity. And actually what it does is it allows people to reflect on their core purpose and why they came into education, which is to support children and young people. So I think just being really clear about what it is and what it isn't is quite important. And we know that it can be delivered in various ways. So you can have one-to-one supervision, and that is often facilitated by a professional supervisor. Many of them do have a clinical background, but it can also be done in groups. And there's some real benefits in group work in terms of building that connection and allowing space for people to realise that actually some of the issues that they're feeling are not just issues that they're feeling themselves. So it can really bring that connection to groups of people. So one of the really good bits of news for those that don't know on this webinar is that Education Support are offering fully funded professional supervision and peer support groups. So if you don't know about that, I'm hoping one of my team that's on this webinar can pop the link into the chat. If not, I'll do it after. But this is funded by both DfE and Welsh Government. And so what we're offering is if you're a head teacher, a deputy head teacher or an assistant head teacher, so there is a remit around, the funding, we can offer you either 6 sessions of professional supervision, one-to-one, or we can offer you 6 sessions of peer support groups. So you'll be put in a group with 7 other staff, and again you'll have 6 sessions, and that's fully funded until March next year. So if you haven't taken the opportunity, get on and sign up. We've got spaces. We're getting really great feedback. We're seeing really brilliant impact, both in terms of how people are experiencing the support, but the impact it's having on their own personal mental health and well-being. So I do think funding is an issue, and I think it's very difficult when we know that schools have got budgets that they have to pay for lots of things, and those budgets are not growing, they are reducing, that often staff mental health and well-being can kind of fall by the wayside. So that's why we will continue to advocate for funding for this, and offer it as long as we're able to, where it's funded. So yes, just sign up if you haven't already. That offer is there for you.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure that we put all of those links into the email that we send out to everybody when we send you out this recording. So don't panic if you don't get to click on it right now. We'll make sure that we send you that too. Bev, do you receive supervision?
No. No. This is actually something that's becoming quite close to my heart. It's not something I've ever really sought before. However, when you speak to professionals in other environments, such as the NHS, for example, and then you find out that they're having supervision almost weekly, and then I think back to my own career of well, nearly 30 years of teaching and being involved in so much safeguarding work, and then not actually having had an hour of safeguarding over all of that time, let alone an hour a week. And I think back to some of the things that I've seen, as I'm sure many colleagues here have seen. I've watched children being taken away from their parents. I've given evidence in court. I've had children make allegations against staff. I've had parents make allegations against staff, trying to manage all of those things. A child makes an allegation about another child, and then you're going through all of those processes alongside often a very deep sadness about the start in life that some of our children experience. And I think that perhaps is something that lives with you, and you take with you, and you don't even realize that you're carrying. So to have an opportunity to reflect on those things, and to actually to have that deeper learning for yourself, and obviously to share that with colleagues, possibly, I think would be so very useful. I know that my governors have been looking for that. And as I said, often you don't even realize that you might need it. As Mike said, it's support, and you think, no, I'm absolutely fine. And I'm sure I'll continue to be fine. However, how much better could I be, both professionally and personally, if I had that opportunity? Because I think it is so worthwhile. So I'm going to be definitely signing up on that link.
Do it's true what you say about how it never leaves you as well. I've been out of schools now for nearly 6 years, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of some of those families that I've worked with, and think about how they're getting on, and where those children are, and what's happened to them. So you're absolutely right. Even though you don't think that you need it at the time, it never leaves you. It's always there. Absolutely. So we're going to go on to our next poll, and our next poll is going to be: which of the following types of support do you feel you would benefit most from? Reflective discussions with fellow DSLs, one-to-one supervision, group supervision with fellow DSLs, self-care guides, or anything else? How do you think that it would be best for you to receive supervision? So far, it's the one-to-one supervision that's in the lead. Yeah, and I think that would be certainly my choice. I think that I would benefit very much from one-to-one supervision, but I also think that I'd benefit from the other ones as well. It feels like it would be best to have something of all of those, and not just to have to choose one. Okay, we're going to speed on to our next question, which is our final question, which is, when do you suggest that DSLs seek support, and how do you suggest that they do that? So, Bev, have you ever needed to seek support?
I think informally I have. I haven't necessarily needed to seek a formally organised support. I think about the multidisciplinary teams that I work within, and being able to talk to colleagues from different professions, and also for them being able to speak to me. And I remember having a conversation not so long ago, just walking out to the gate with a social worker who all of a sudden offloaded everything at the gate to me and said, I'm so sorry, but I just thought you would understand. And I said, actually, I do really, really understand. And from that, we've had a relationship where we've been able to talk together and say, how has your week been? How are you doing? You know, is there anything you need to offload or talk about, without giving any information or details about cases or anything, but just actually having somebody outside of the profession sometimes is useful, because they give you a different take on it. I'm lucky to have a really strong, supportive staff, and also to have a strong senior leadership team. But often it's from an unlikely member of staff that might suddenly say, you know, are you okay? I've been a little bit worried about you. Just everything going okay? Do you want to have a chat? So it's been in those informal settings sometimes. But as I said earlier, I think I haven't sought it, and I suppose maybe I've been lucky in that sense. And I don't know if I would ever necessarily need to seek it in order for my well-being. However, I think to have that deeper professional learning would impact on my well-being, and maybe I would recognise more then that it's something that I do actually need, or maybe I didn't need it as much, but I think to have the option to have it would be the most useful aspect. I think to know it's there, and that it's a resource that I can use. Because as I said, sometimes you don't actually realise what you're carrying, and how much better that you could feel afterwards. So yeah, I hope that answers really.
Absolutely. You know, and it's individual as well, isn't it? It's just as we would deal with case by case. It's individual by individual as well, and what one person needs might be very different to what another person needs as well. Faye, how can our DSLs seek support?
Yeah, I've seen a few questions and things in the chat about the professional supervision and peer support and who it's for. So we do have sort of restrictions around funding and who we can deliver that to. So currently it's for state-funded primary and secondary schools, and for anybody who's in assistant head role and above. We are always exploring and having discussions about who we could be able to open this support out to. And obviously we recognise those that are responsible for safeguarding are a key group of people that could really benefit from that. So I think just stay to sort of watch this space, and we'll keep you updated as things progress. But we do have our helpline. So for anybody that needs in the moment support, whether that's that you've just dealt with a really difficult conversation and you feel like you need to kind of offload, whether that is that you're feeling particularly worried or stressed about a particular issue, it doesn't have to just be work related, it could be personal life related. So you can contact our helpline, and that's on 08000 562 561. We'll share the details following the webinar as well. So there is that in the moment support for anybody that needs it. Then obviously for those that are able to access, you can access our professional supervision or peer support groups. And as I say, the impact of those are really, really positive, and we're seeing really good results from that work. Our website has a huge number of resources on there. So going back to Mike's point, We talk about how we can support across 3 levels. So we recognise the role that individuals have to play in terms of looking after their own mental health and well-being, and that of their colleagues, because we're a community, and how do we look out for each other? But we have to recognise that those individuals work within an organisation, and that organisation has a set of cultures and conditions and policies and practices. So we have got a whole host of tools on our website that can help you think about how you can create those really psychologically safe cultures and workplaces. But then we also have to recognise that in education, you also operate in a much bigger system, and that bigger system impacts on the organisation, which can impact on the individual. So it's very complex. But I think the key takeaway here is that even though you are operating in a system and an organisation, and sometimes you may feel like those things are having a negative impact on your well-being, there are still things that you can do at an individual level to look after yourself. And it goes back to Bev's point about that personal responsibility. We only have one life. And I think that Bev made a really good point about who are the people in your life personally that would miss you if you weren't around. So yeah, reach out for us if you need to have that in the moment support. Go to our website. We are here for you, and we're here to support you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think now's a really good time to mention our free safeguarding community as well. And our safeguarding community has been offered totally free to anybody who works in safeguarding, and it's a safe place for you to be able to communicate with other DSLs and other safeguarding leads. You can ask questions. We've got 3 different rooms in there as well. The first one is a safeguarding staff room where you can talk about anything that isn't of a sensitive nature, maybe from policies or some of the questions that we've had around supervision. What's the best place to get that training and support? Those are the kind of questions that you would have in the safeguarding staff room. But we've also got a safe room, and that safe room is totally anonymous. Whoever posts in there or comments in there for more of those sensitive questions. And it's something that I ideally wish that I'd had as a safeguarding lead, because, there was just me. And I was bound by confidentiality. I couldn't speak to anybody about anything. And the amount of sleepless nights that I had worrying about my children and my family and what would be the next best steps, because we've all helped and supported in different situations. And just because you've not come across a situation before doesn't mean that somebody else hasn't. And they might know some really good charities or some really good resources that can help and support. And that's exactly what the safeguarding community is to facilitate that. So we'll make sure that we send that link as well. I think we've probably got about enough time for one question. So I do apologise to everybody who has been asking questions, but I will make sure that our panel answers them, and we shall make sure that we send them out to you. So I think that one of them is for you, Faye, which is around, is the supervision available for further education as well as state?
So we're not currently funded to deliver that, although we are running a small pilot currently where we're supporting 40 further education leaders through professional supervision. So we're testing it with a small cohort just to see how that works, and we are evaluating that independently, and we hope to have that evaluation finalised in March. So, it's really important for us that we test and we sort of look at the impact. And so as a result of that, we'll then be thinking about what we can potentially do for the further education sector. But just to be really clear that our helpline and all, the resources and tools are all accessible for anybody working in any stage of education.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And one quick one for you, Mike. Will the safeguarding company be offering supervision training?
No, it's not something we currently provide. So I think, and we did actually explore the potential for delivering supervision training probably about 2 years ago now. But Faye will probably say this, there's a lot to it, so our advice would be, there are options out there. And obviously, Faye's described obviously the kind of service that they could provide. And I would certainly recommend that approach because it's a complex area, like we've said. It needs to be managed by people that understand supervision and can provide a really professional service. It's not like providing just a piece of training or providing a resource is provided by professional people that understand, the ins and outs of supervision, because and you're dealing with, some very complex and sensitive issues with individuals that, needs to be managed properly. So.
Absolutely, and making sure that you get the right service as well. Just to end this webinar on a bit of a lighter note, as a safeguarding governor, I really championed that we needed to have supervision for our DSLs and for our safeguarding team, and it took me 12 months, and I managed to get it, and I booked it in, and I went to go in and see the safeguarding team, and I said, how did it go? And they said, oh yeah, no, we felt wonderful afterwards. The hot stones were fabulous. I said, I'm sorry, hot stones? She said, yeah. She said, we had our supervision and they put hot stones on us, and they sorted out our recce, things like that.
That's brilliant.
So yes, please make sure that you fully understand what the supervision should be, and you don't fall into my trap. Thank you so much for our panel for joining us today. I know that it's been absolutely fantastic for all of the people that have participated. And again, please don't worry if you haven't managed to come to the live session. We'll make sure that we send it out to anybody. We'll send everything out to everybody. We'll make sure that we add all of those links as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I hope you've found the session as useful and interesting as I certainly have. And again, thank you very much to our panel members for joining us here today. And you shall all receive an email from us very soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely evening.